Now one of these two bikes is the brand new Triumph Speed T4, and if you can't figure out at first glance which bike is which, well then you are in the right place, because today we are riding the T4 and finding out just how it differs compared to the Speed 400. Now on the surface they look very similar, but there are some key differences between the two bikes, and we'll first explore those differences before we go into finding out how the T4 rides and whether you should spend your money on the 400 or save some money and buy the T4 instead. Now, as I mentioned, the bikes look very similar, but the first difference you can spot immediately is the fork. Now the T4 gets a conventional fork, while the 400 gets an upside down fork, that too in golden, and that does look quite premium. Then of course you have the mirrors, which on the 400 are barred mirrors and also look very nice and premium, while the ones on the T4, they are the stock type mirrors, and these are the ones from the Scrambler 400X, and while they do function really well, they just don't look as nice as the ones on the 400. The second thing you notice are the exhausts. Now they are identical in every way in function, but the one on the 400 gets a brushed metal finish, while the one on the T4 is matte black. So if matte black is your thing, this might be the bike for you, and also makes the bike look a little bit slimmer than the 400. That said, the M/24 Speed 400 also gets the same matte black exhaust as the T4. And once you get into the weeds, you start noticing more differences as well. For example, on the T4, the handlebar, the rear brake pedal and the shift lever are all steel, while the same thing on the 400 is more premium aluminium. And when it comes to components, you start seeing some differences in the brakes as well. The disc size is the same for both, but the 400 gets a radial caliper, while the one on the T4 is axial. And then of course you have the tires. Now the 400 gets radial tires. Now this last gen bike got tires from Apollo or MRF, while the new one, the MR25, gets them from Bridgestone, but radials again. The T4, well, it gets tires from MRF and these are bias ply. Also the rear tire on the T4 is a bit slimmer than the one on the 400. So now coming to the differences that you cannot see, and that is the engine. Now both the engines, same capacity, same bore and stroke, but the one on the T4 makes 9 PS and 1.5 Nm less compared to the 400. Now of course Triumph has had to compensate for this by giving the T4 better bottom end torque with a heavier flywheel, and also the throttle on the T4 is a mechanical throttle, while the one on the 400 is ride-by-wire. Now both the T4 and the 400 have the exact same 6-speed gearbox with the same gear ratios, but the T4 gets taller overall gearing thanks to a smaller 39-tooth rear sprocket, while the 400 gets a larger 43-tooth rear sprocket. So how do these differences translate into the way the T4 rides on the road? So let's talk performance. Now is the T4 as quick as the 400? Of course not. Even by Triumph's own claims, the T4 takes 1.3 seconds longer to get to 100 kph from 0, but that's something we'll verify once you get the bike for a longer road test. But does it feel slow? Well, not really, because the T4 has much better low end torque compared to the Speed 400. In fact, this bike, even though it has less peak torque than the 400, it makes more torque from 3000 to 500,000 RPM, which means if you're in the city, this motor is really responsive and really easy to ride and tractable as well. Which means if you want to carry high gears in low speeds, you can do that. 30 in 4th gear, no problem. 40 in 5th, no issues at all. And even at these speeds, if you open the throttle hard, there is barely any juddering at all. So what about the highway? Well, here the T4 has a trick up its sleeve, and that is a smaller rear sprocket, giving it overall taller gearing, which means at 100 kph in 6th gear, the engine is doing around 500,000 RPM, which is around 500 RPM lower than that on the Speed 400. And the bike can stay at those speeds, 100 kph, pretty much all day long, and it feels really smooth there. But if you want to go faster than that, the T4 does feel a bit out of breath. But what about throttle response? Well, as you mentioned that the Speed 400 gets a ride-by-wire throttle, while the T4 gets a mechanical throttle body. Now actually I prefer this over the 400 because the 400 can feel a bit jumpy, especially during on and off throttle transitions. The T4 here feels really smooth, especially at slow speeds. It's almost like you have a direct connection between the right wrist and the engine. So does it ride well? Actually, the ride quality is quite plush for the most part. The front suspension feels soft enough to absorb most bumps quite well, but the rear feels slightly stiffer. If you take larger bumps at speed, the rear shock feels a little jarring and can toss you off the seat a little. At lower speeds, this isn't an issue, but we feel that overall, the Speed 400 has a slightly more plush ride quality compared to the T4. That said, the T4 is actually quite a nice bike when it comes to handling, where the Speed 400 feels a little bit too quick to steer and can catch new riders by surprise. The T4 steers a bit slower and feels more predictable. It's not lazy by any means, and cutting through traffic is super easy, and those MRF biased flat tires hold up pretty well even on wet roads. Now we haven't tested the braking performance of the T4 yet, but we are fairly certain that given the difference in tires and brakes, the 400 will stop quicker than the T4. Surprisingly though, the T4's front brake actually has better feel compared to the 400's and is easier to modulate. So should you buy the Triumph Speed T4? Well, it depends on who you are really. If you're someone who already likes fast bikes, can ride fast bikes and want a near roadster that is also quick and good for highway use, I think the Speed 400 might make more sense for you. But if you're someone new to big bikes, starting a journey on these mid-capacity motorcycles, and want something mostly for city use with occasional highway use, I think the T4 makes a lot of sense. Where the Speed 400 is more revvy like a modern motorcycle, the T4 feels actually more retro and a lot more easygoing. It almost reminds us a little of the Java 42, chilled out yet quick enough. And given the recent options in the market like the Hero Maverick 440 and the Harley Davidson X440, we do believe that there are takers in India for easygoing 400s as well. But the one place we think that Triumph India could have done much better is the pricing. Yes, at 2.17 lakh, it is around 23 grand cheaper than the Speed 400. But given the difference in equipment, we think the price could have come down to say 2 lakh rupees or a little lower, and then that would have been absolutely perfect.